A day one free agency move, you say, for the Minnesota Wild? We'll talk about what Yakov Trenin brings to the table and what it means for an already cloudy middle six picture.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. With the playoffs in the rearview mirror, the sports stop sportsing the way we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we'll talk about what Yakov Trenin brings to the table as a hard-hitting bottom six addition for the Minnesota Wild. We'll talk about how that adds a little more cloudiness to basically the bottom nine for the Minnesota Wild, and some news coming in as well about a two-way contract also signed today. So we will talk about all of that coming up here for you on today's episode of Locked On Wild, the bonus episode. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and free agency underway. The Nashville Predators making massive moves and a lot of money being exchanged by teams all around. And the Minnesota Wild getting involved on day one, but not in the way that you probably would have thought. David Perron going to the Ottawa Senators for a couple of years at $4 million per. The Minnesota Wild signing Yakov Trenin to a 4-year, $3.5 million AAV deal to add to the mix. And this has been a focus for the Minnesota Wild since the season ended. You bring in Jacob Loco. I think it's Jacob. You bring in Loco to add to the mix, and now you bring in Yakov Trenin. And Trenin is 27. He's a 6'2", 201-pound forward listed as a center. So I think he can play both. But originally drafted by Nashville in the 2015 draft, he was a second-round pick, 55th overall. And you look at what Trenin has done over the last few years. Initially started in the 2019-2020 season with 2 goals, 4 assists, and 6 total points in 21 games. 2020-2021, he had 5 goals and 6 assists, 11 points in 45 games. Then in 2021-2022, 17 goals in 80 games. 2022-2023, he had 12 goals and 12 assists in 77 games. And this past season played with Nashville and with Colorado. All told, 76 games played. He had 12 goals, 5 assists. Not a huge points guy, because what he brings to the table is the hits. Had 207 hits this past season combined between Nashville and Colorado. 167 the year before that, and 191 back in 2021, 2022. And some other analysis, Jay Fresh, Yakov Trenin signing a $3.5 million AAV deal with Minnesota, is a defensive winger and penalty killer who forechecks and hits. Has some sneaky skill with the puck, although nobody scored on any of his passes last season. His projected WAR, 51%, 92% of his value defensively, 97% on the penalty kill. So, look, On the surface, right off the bat, as Dom Lashuzin of The Athletic also has him with a +2 defensive rating, -5 offensively, and projected value of $2.3 million, at least based off of The Athletic spot. Contract by itself is probably 1 year too many, but you look at some of the money that's being thrown at these guys, especially bottom six guys. The price really doesn't bother me. But what have we been saying for the last what have we been saying for the last year and a half? The contracts at face value by themselves are fine. It's when you add them all together that the issues start to arise. And so now you look at what the Minnesota Wild have on their roster right now. They have 13 forwards right now. Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson, Matt Zuccarello, Marcus Foligno, Ryan Hartman, Yakov Trenin, Freddie Gaudreau, Marcus Johansson, Marat Khusnutdinov, Liam Ohgren, Marco Rossi, and Jacob Loco. That's your 13 forwards right now. And so pretty easy, Kaprizov, Boldy, Eriksson, likely your top line again. But what does the picture look like beyond that? Like, it's one thing to bring in a guy like Trenin after having made the decision to move on from Mason Shaw, from Vinny Lettieri, and likely from Jake Lucchini as well. It's one thing to do that and add that into a mix when your top six, when your top two lines for sure are more ironed out. But it just creates this really confusing picture as to what the rest of the lineup is going to look like, because those 13 forwards include right now Marat Khusnutdinov and Liam Ohgren, but they do not include the potential for Riley Heights if he does get a chance to add into that mix. It just continues to kind of cloudy the pool, muddy the waters. And I spoke at length about not being super thrilled about the possibility of adding a David Perron to the mix, but I think David Perron would have pretty clearly been a second line guy, as opposed to, and I'm not saying that Trenin didn't fill a need, because the penalty kill was abysmal. And so you get a guy, and the ability for this Minnesota Wild team to be physical, there were so many guys that just didn't provide that for this team last year. And Trenin does both. So it definitely addresses a need, but you still have all of these question marks on the roster. You still have all these spots where you feel like you need more. And now, if anything, you're pushing one of those guys higher in the lineup, because now you've got two spots on the fourth line that have already been solidly filled. And assuming that Freddie Gaudreau stays, he's probably your fourth line center. And so your fourth line's taken care of. Your third line becomes Foligno, Hartman, and probably Marat Khusnutdinov as your third line. Second line, Zuccarello, Rossi, and I mean, it's got to be Ohgren at this point, unless you flip and you push Hartman up to the second line. But then you've got Marcus Johansson still in the mix too. This one, it just feels like kind of adding wet firewood to a fire. And unless they make a move to ship somebody off the roster, it just fills up a roster spot without addressing some of the other roster spots in which you feel like you should be getting way more. So $3.5 million, that doesn't really bother me. 4 years, that's probably 1 year too many. But again, you put Loco and Trenin on the same line, and those guys they're gonna rough some people up. So fine. But like let's shake up some of that. Let's shake up some of that middle. Like it's one thing for them to be like legitimately fourth line guys, because I don't think we're going to put Trenin or Loco above that spot. But let's do some work to try to weed out everything in between. So we'll talk about that. They're also, from what Michael Russo has been saying on Twitter, it's likely that there is another forward coming in on a 2-way contract. So we'll talk about that, as it sounds like actually it sounds like there are 2 of them. So we'll talk about a couple of depth moves adding to the mix as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, you know me. I love sports so much that I want them to just be 24/7, 12 months a year. Just keep the NHL season going all year long, NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, so we don't ever have to go through the lulls in which only one sport is active. Because when the sports aren't sportsing like we like them to, that's when I get a little sad. But FanDuel is here to help. They can keep the sports going whenever you want them to. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you are in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking all customers up with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild, bonus episode of Locked On Wild here today. And don't worry, we got another episode coming for you. I know I promised that we would break down the draft class in depth. Just didn't expect that the Minnesota Wild are going to be this active or active at all, really, here today. And so not only do we have the Yakov Trenin signing, a couple of 2-way contracts that the Wild have added to the mix as well. Let's start with Devin Shore. A 2-way contract. Shore brings 443 games of NHL experience. And so likely going to start the season in Iowa, but helps that Iowa group out too. If he doesn't play in the NHL at all, if anything else, helps add a little experience down to Iowa so that they have some direction to be able to head to. Travis Boyd also signed to a 2-way contract. Boyd, at 30 years old, has 296 NHL games under his belt the past 3 years, which have been with Arizona. So Bill Guerin talked about this in trying to add more depth, not necessarily even to the NHL roster, but just to the organization too, because some of the guys that they were throwing onto the roster to try to fill spots last year was pretty bad. And so adding some guys to the pipeline, and it's not likely that Devin Shore or Travis Boyd will factor into the mix much until something else happens to free up a spot on this roster. But it's such a young team in Iowa that it makes a difference to have some guys that can kind of show them the ropes. And so those are just two other signings that happened here so far today. But I want to get back to talking more about kind of this muddy picture, because as of right now, Kaprizov, Eriksson, Ek, and Boldy, your top line is set. Forget it. Set it, forget it. Matt Zuccarello, Marco Rossi, and I mean, at this point, you either go young with Liam Ohgren on that second line spot, or are you going to go Ryan Hartman in that spot? Because if you just put Marcus Johansson right back in there, I'm going to scream. Like it just, and stepping back a little bit, like we knew that it was going to be tight over these couple of seasons. But I think the thing that frustrates people the most is that it would be one thing to say these years are going to be tight, but all these deals that have been thrown around, 3 or 4 year deals, and honestly, it's leading me down the path of wondering if that is the only way that players want to stick around here long term, is if they literally get long term. Because a lot of these deals are probably 1 year too many. And this is where the frustration comes in from the fans, in that, you know, you just are really limiting yourself with flexibility. And I mean, you look at what these teams are doing in free agency. Like, look at what Nashville did. Steven Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault, Brady Shea. Boom. Right off the bat. Jake Gensel to Tampa Bay. Teams put themselves, and the work that has been done over the last couple of days after the draft got done, teams put themselves in positions to meaningfully impact their roster. And the hope would have been that that opportunity existed for next season. But like, now you go into 2025, 2026, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You've got 8 forward spots locked in. Liam Ohgren is on his ELC. Marat Khusnutdinov will be a restricted free agent. Marco Rossi will be a restricted free agent. Jacob Loco will be a restricted free agent, eligible for arbitration. And it just, like, I don't know. I think we all just wanted maximum flexibility heading into the offseason after the 2024-2025 season. It just feels to me like there is going to have to be a move made. Somebody, you got to subtract somebody from this mix to free up spots, because if you go with your fourth line, unless you have like Freddie Gaudreau be your 13th forward and have him not play, I mean, Loco and Trenin were, it feels like, acquired to play. Gaudreau is the fourth line center. And then all of a sudden, your third line, Foligno, and here's the thing that I worry about. I worry that this is going to come at the expense of, like, now if it's Marat Khusnutdinov, maybe he could. I don't know. I don't even want to talk myself into that. I worry that it comes at the expense of one of these young guys going to Iowa, and what are they really going to learn? What are they really going to learn at the Iowa level that they can't at the NHL level? That's my concern. So if you could unload a Freddie Gaudreau or a Marcus Johansson, if you could unload one of those guys to just clear the picture up a little bit, I think that would help, because at this point, it feels like you're going to get Kaprizov, Boldy, Erikssonek, Zuccarello, Rossi, Johansson, Foligno, Hartman, and probably Ohgren, and then Loco, Trenin, and Khusnutdinov or Goudreau. It's a muddy picture, folks. It's a muddy, cloudy picture. And I just would like to be able to see the bottom. I just would like to see the bottom of the lake so that I know how deep it is, so I can maybe catch some fish. So, and you know, the other thing too is they've retained Philip Gustafsson and Marco Rossi so far to this point. I would hate to get to this point in the season and see, especially on the forward side, oh, we're pretty crowded. Like we gotta free up a spot and then have that be when Marco Rossi's traded. Like it's a cloudy picture. So I don't know. Again, Trenin at face value, probably a year too many, but I just, you stack it up against all the other extensions that have been given out, and that's where the head scratching starts to come in. We will talk about the other big news, as it was made official today that Jack Capuano has been hired as assistant coach for the Minnesota Wild. So we'll talk about that as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Again, a reminder, don't worry. We've got another episode coming for you later today, as we will take a look at the 2024 Minnesota Wild draft class. A little more in depth. What can we expect for the timetable for a few of these guys, especially Zeev Buium? So stay tuned for that. Just wanted to get this out there with some free agency moves coming in here today. So let's talk about Jack Capuano, who has familiarity with John Hines, with their work on the U.S. development team. Capuano comes in having overseen the defense for the Ottawa Senators over the past few years, which was not a great defense, but there are young players in that mix, some with a lot of talent, some with not so much. Hines and Capuano, from Michael Russo's write-up today, have a Rhode Island connection and are longtime friends. Capuano was one of Hines' assistants during last month's World Championship, and in 2016, they were assistants on John Tortorella's USA staff at the World Cup of Hockey. Capuano's role, it's expected that he will run the defense and the penalty kill with one of the other Wild assistants that was brought in to when John Hines was hired, Pat Dwyer. So Pat Dwyer will help with the penalty kill. Capuano will oversee it. The penalty kill is coming off of a rough season. They were 30th at 74.5%. So it's expected to be a major focus in training camp. Capuano ran the defense in Ottawa, and the Senators' blue line left some to be desired beyond the up-and-coming Sanderson. But Capuano would inherit a fairly strong top four, including Jared Spurgeon, Jake Middleton, Brock Faber, and Jonas Brodin. So, I know, and it doesn't really change my feelings about this, but you look at this Ottawa Senators defense. They got Jake Sanderson, Thomas Chabot, Artem Zub, Nick Jensen, who was just acquired for Jacob Chikrin, who was another part of that and really underperformed. Travis Hamonic and Jacob Bernard Docker. That's your decor. That's not great. So there could be part of this equation in which you can only coach up a team so much. That could be part of it. And so it will be interesting to see what Capuano does, what sorts of suggestions he has for this group, because this is the other part about it too, is the Wild they haven't made like major changes defensively for a while. And so, they had their scheme that they ran under Dean Evison. This has always been a team that has taken great pride in their defensive performance. So will Capuano be able to come in and kind of say, hey, for once, I finally have some quality guys that I can scheme around? Or is it going to be that the players were just struggling with the scheme? That'll be the key thing. That'll be the key thing to watch here, is if this Wild defense, if they try some new things and they're able to continue to perform strongly like they have over the last few seasons. That will be something to see. I'm just concerned about the penalty kill. Like, that's the big one, because you are going to have mostly the same guys from last year on that unit, with the exception of, Jared Spurgeon missed a bunch of the season with injury. It's going to be mostly the same penalty kill unit. So can Capuano, with some better pieces, can he help that unit out? If he does, then I will change my tune. But it's just kind of my overall feeling with how things have been going over these last couple of seasons is like continue to try to kind of catch fire from previously successful seasons, as opposed to trying to just go in a new direction and try to set yourself up for I don't know, just it's a new way of doing things, and a new, like, potentially finding some new assistants that really pop. Some guys that can find new ways to succeed. Like, that's kind of all the stuff that I look at. But at the end of the day, all that matters is how that penalty kill does. If that penalty kill unit improves drastically, it was a great move. If not, well, then you're probably not going to be able to majorly impact that special teams unit until you get some of these guys off the roster. So time will tell in that regard as to whether that works out or not. Now, I want to finish with just a couple of things to keep an eye on here over the rest of the week. It sounds like Michael Russo tweeted today that he expects to see a Jake Middleton extension. Knowing my luck, it would not surprise me if it happens the moment I hit end on this recording. I'm really intrigued to see what happens with that Middleton extension. It's been rumored to be a 4x4 for a while. I wonder if Zeev Buium changes any bit of that by being able to come in and once his Denver season is done. He should be able to hop onto the NHL roster at that point. So does that mean more for him? Does that mean more for Declan Chisholm? That's going to be interesting for me to keep an eye on here And if it gets to the point, like if we get to the point that, the Middleton deal is a shorter deal, then that decision making absolutely factored into that. So keep an eye on that. Former Minnesota Wild defenseman Matt Dumba will not be returning to Minnesota because he just signed with the Dallas Stars. And so Dallas replaced Ryan Suter with Matt Dumba. So that Dallas is becoming Minnesota South for more reasons than one. And so I just wanted to throw that in too, because I know that was a rumbling in other areas that maybe Matt Dumba would be coming back home for a little bit of a homecoming. But that is not how that is going to happen. And of course, we remember the big hit in the postseason a couple of years ago that sparked the series quite a bit. So best of luck to Matt Dumba there in Dallas. I'm sure he'll have plenty to try to hit when the Wild play the Stars at some point this season. We know the season will be getting underway on October 10th. That'll be a home game against the Columbus Blue Jackets. Beyond that, the schedule, I think, is coming out tomorrow. So we'll keep an eye on that too. But free agency day one, lots of roster moves. Yakov Trenin coming in for the Minnesota Wild and further kind of clouding that middle to bottom six picture. We'll see if somebody moves. It feels like somebody has to, but we'll have to wait and see in that regard. But that will do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. And when we bring bonus episodes to you, we've got another one coming today to take a look at the 2024 draft class. So keep an eye out, subscribe, make sure you don't miss out as we guide you through the rest of the offseason here on Locked On Wild. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.